project, the research that I'm conducting for the SFB, really in many ways begins from a quite basic empirical question. Before we can go to anything more complicated, we actually have to know what we're looking for. And in this case, the question was, where do we actually find uses of contemporary Balinese script? And in an effort to try to learn the answer to this, I began with you could say, a house yard survey. In the small community of Batananka, where I've been doing research over the course of the last several years, there are 71 house yards, and so I began by visiting, together with a Balinese colleague, a series of house yards, and we went from house to house and literally tallied up every single use of script that we could find as a first step. And in addition to asking about the script itself, we were interested in, obviously, how it was being used. We're in our project specifically interested in the use of script for instance in the context of rites of passage, architecture, healing, sorcery. Not always things people are ready to talk extremely openly about. But in many of these cases, one actually has to enlist various forms of expertise. So in addition to trying to learn where we find script, what it's being used for, we wanted to know what kinds of expertise were being employed. And in part, this was a way of allowing this to emerge sort of, as much as one can say naturally, to emerge directly, I'll say, from a set of practices in a particular locale. So in other words, oftentimes when research is conducted in a place like Bali, one arbitrarily picks an expert, quote unquote. And what I was trying to do was to, in effect, get a local perspective on expertise, and then, in a sense, work up from there. So that if I began from house yard practices, local, should we say, very loosely speaking, village level practice, to work up from there to the kinds of expertise that are being employed, and then, through a similar sort of research with experts who are locally employed, one gets an expert perspective on local practice. And so it was in the interplay between these then that one began to be able to see some of the ideals and sensibilities at play in local writing practices. The term aksara is from Sanskrit, it's akshara, and is often translated in at least the literature on Bali as indestructible, quote unquote. And my understanding is that this emerged in part out of early Indic phonological analysis, that these are the smallest units of language that cannot be broken down further, in principle. And Balinese used the term to refer to single units of written word. And so, in other words, a spoken word is not an aksara. It's a written character that is an aksara. In fact, the quote-unquote Balinese alphabet is simply called aksara Bali, and it has an anachara, kada, tasa, wala, etc. And each of these is placed on a different part of one's body, or resides there, as it were. And there are various forms of contemplative techniques for placing these on the body for various ends. Self-protection, literally animating oneself. And that's one of the sort of most interesting points about these, that whereas in the broadly Western tradition one tends to think of the dead letter, that writing is dead and has to be brought to life. But in fact, aksara in Bali are said to be alive. And by being alive, one of the things that means is that they are capable of self-transformation and effecting change in the world. In studies of everything from writing practices to the organization of domestic space, materiality is one of the more important, or has been a rather important theme over the last several years. One of the things that I believe this project and research in Bali more generally may have to contribute to those discussions is the fact that many of those things which we quote unquote, broadly Euro-Americans, modern Euro-Americans, what have you, tend to think of as dead matter, inanimate objects, are in Balinese taken as given to be alive, or I shouldn't say taken as given, but are assumed to be alive. And it's fascinating, in fact, to discover that it's almost impossible, as far as I can tell, in colloquial Balinese, to actually say the phrase dead matter. To translate it directly, lakarmati means you're going to die. So the question then is, what does it mean to be alive in Bali? Everything from houses to texts to copperplate inscriptions, sharp instruments, shadow puppets are all said to idu, or to maurip, which is a way of saying that they are alive. Now, that means that there's something recognized in common between those and human bodies, which tend to be our classic locus of where we have a coming together of agency, materiality, and life. Well, interestingly enough, so too are these aksara, loci of agency, materiality, and life. And so what I'm interested in is how that differs from broadly modern Euro-American conceptions. There are two basic, shall we say, clusters of sensibilities around writing. One that is, again, for a convenient shorthand, we'll say broadly representational. This is the idea that script and writing in some way, and language more generally for that matter, point beyond itself, point beyond themselves. In other words, the power of writing, if it has any, is its ability to, say, point to meaning or to a message. Where Balinese script is seen as an index of a traditional culture, its power is its ability to point to that traditional culture. On the other hand, you have what we'll say very loosely, is an older set of sensibilities in which writing does not in fact point beyond itself, but in fact its very efficacy is its presence. The idea that it's able, as we were talking about a moment ago, to in effect almost channel a certain sort of efficacy or energy that allows an organ to do what it does. And you have these two sets of sensibilities side by side. Coming back to materiality, this is something that has been largely ignored. Matter, like the medium, was seen as incidental, an accident that simply helped to bring along the substance, the authentic text and its meaning. This is grounded in a long tradition of broadly European thought about meaning, communication, etc. We're interested as much as anything in local understandings or local conceptualizations, local presuppositions regarding the nature of materiality. And the very fact that matter is, the matter that makes up the text is alive, itself ought to be taken seriously. In various forms of rites of passage, in circumstances where one wishes to protect oneself or to reinvigorate or to reanimate one's organs and things of the sort, one will place aksara in various parts of the body. In my view, the use of these aksara is very, at least the logic that orders the use of them in this kind of bodily inscription is about an intensification of the body. It is about the increasing of a sort of flow of a kind of vital energy through the body, in through the various bodily pores and out, or orifices and out, so that you have a kind of flow. Should we be extended for a second period of research, I will be carrying the project to Java, where I'll be looking at the question as to, in the first instance, to what extent there are parallels. And also, given that in Bali you have the interplay between two very different sets of script, namely modern Roman script on the one hand, and what's, I guess for lack of a way of putting it, modern Balinese script on the other. in Java, you have various forms of Arabic script that complicate the situation considerably, and that will be one of the things that I'll be looking forward to exploring, to what extent these things are still parallel. There are passing references in the literature to what appear to be similar uses of Arabic script on broadly ritual instruments that appear to parallel things that I've seen in Bali. But again, the strengths of the Balinese study are its rootedness in local practice and local commentary, that is to say, how local people understand what they're doing. And it will be some time in Java before I'm able to comment on that.